Everyone, welcome back to more Flesh and Bad, and today we're going to be doing a presentation on rate. So this is meant to be kind of a follow-up to one of our previous educational videos where we kind of did a high-level overview of like what rate is and like how you can analyze cards and stuff, but I felt like that was a little bit shallow, so I wanted to kind of do a more kind of like deep dive presentation on all things rate, value, and I guess try to answer the question, how are we comparing cards to other cards to determine whether they're good, they're bad, or they're like about average, right? I think that's basically the question we're trying to get to here. So if you like this video, feel free to let us know in the comments, and yeah, we'll go ahead and get into the discussion. So the question I like to propose to you is, how do we know what cards are good and bad? And I have a couple examples here on the slide to kind of illustrate my point. But Blaze Headlong is, I think, one of the staples of Draconic decks. Just a very, very solid 0 for 4 attack that pretty much just sees play in, I think, almost every Draconic deck. Just a very, very solid staple kind of piece. Very, very solid card. But what makes this card good, right? Similar thing, I guess, to Rise Above. Rise Above is a card that I think is maybe in competition for one of the worst cards in the game. Just having a terrible kind of stat line and a ability that's not incredibly good. So this card also is kind of like very, very bad, but why is it bad? And we also have Aether Spindle. Aether Spindle is a card that is a little bit tricky to evaluate, but the card is obviously good. It's just a kind of a question of like, how good is this card? These are kind of the questions I want to try to answer during this presentation. Is like, how do we know that like Blaze Headlong is good and Rise Above is bad? And how do we know like, how do we even evaluate Aether Spindle? One of the initial questions that we might ask ourselves when we're trying to determine how good or bad a card is how much does it attack for block for? And I think this is a decent starting point, right? So we have a couple examples here. Sink Below, obviously one of the staples of the game, just being a 0-cost block 4 that also has an additional filtering upside, is a very, very good card. Same thing with like Ravenous Rabble, just kind of similar stat line to Sink Below, just 0 for 4, go again, attack. And then we also have like Command and Conquer over here, which is basically like a 2-card 6 that can sometimes like force your opponent to basically block with 3 blocks from hand. When we're talking about just the stats on the card and analyzing the stats depending on the situation, what we're really kind of talking about is value. We've kind of talked about value before in kind of these educational series, but it helps to kind of give like a brief introduction here, just in case anyone hasn't seen those other videos. But let's talk about the value of Wounding Blow again. So Wounding Blow is a 0-cost 4 attack or 3 block. So if we attack with Wounding Blow, we basically get 4 value. If we defend with Wounding Blow, we get 3 value. And we're only using 1 card for this exchange, so this is either a 1 card 4 or it's a 1 card 3, right? And the value can depend on the situation, right? So if we're forced to block with this card, it's obviously a 3 block. If we're forced to attack with it, or if we get to attack with this card, it's a 4 attack, right? So the value can kind of change depending on the situation, which is an important thing to know. We also have this kind of similar static card in Wounded Bull. And if we attack with Wounded Bull, we're basically paying three resources to attack for either 7 or 8. And if we defend with Wounded Bull, we're basically getting 2 block on defense. So if we assume that we're kind of like pitching like a blue 3 block here, for instance, we either have the choice, if we want to like defend, we can either block with like 5 here, 2 and 3, or we can pay the blue to basically send 7 or 8. And we're using 2 cards to basically do that. So this is functionally a 2-card 8, which is kind of like a similar stat line to Wounded Bull, which is a 1-card 4, right? So 2-card 8, 1-card 4, very similar stat cards. We're basically just using more cards to get the same stat. I wanted to also go on a brief tangent here that bigger cards functionally net you action points, which is kind of like a weird thing to think about, but I kind of wanted to illustrate with this example that we're kind of using here. So we have 2 Wounding Blows on the side, and to cast 2 Wounding Blows on the same turn, we functionally need 2 action points, right? We need 1 action point for the first Wounding Blow, 1 action point for the second Wounding Blow, so 2 action points in total. To play Wounded Bull, which is basically getting the same amount of damage as 2 Wounding Blows, we're pitching 2. We're using the same 2 cards, right? But we only need to use 1 action point because we're casting a bigger card. So it's important to note that within like the design space of the game, the bigger the card is, the more action points it kind of functionally nets you, which is also why like I think bigger cards are kind of limited in terms of design space. And when we talk about value, I think it's also kind of important to bring up what I like to call the fundamental thesis of Fab. Which is kind of like the guiding principle that the game designers use to make the game. So for a single card in Fab, you should roughly expect to get 4 value on attack and 3 block on defense. And this is mainly kind of targeted at red cards. So this is not always the case, like some cards block for 2, some cards block for 4. But for the most part, throughout the game, for an attack action, you should roughly expect to get 4 value when you're attacking with it and 3 on block on defense. When we want to compare cards to other cards, what we really want to look at is rate as opposed to value. And I think it's important to note that cards and TCGs don't exist in a vacuum. How we were kind of analyzing Wounding Blow earlier is we were just looking at the stats on the card without really comparing it to any other cards in the game. And if we don't compare it to other cards in the game, we might be under the impression that like, oh, Wounding Blow is like a good card because its stats are good or whatever. But when we really compare it to the rest of the cards in the game, this card is like easily just like draft chaff, right? And I think ultimately rate is determined by whatever the designers of the game think a card should be. That is kind of like the rate that they set for a card. But we can also kind of infer this by directly comparing cards to other cards in the game to determine if they're on rate, below rate, or above rate. And I've kind of defined these down here. So on rate is approximately about like an average card, below rate is a below average card, and above rate is an above average card. I think there is also a couple important caveats to note when we're kind of talking about rate and specifically like what is an average card. And I think one note to kind of add here is that average card really depends on the format. So for instance, I'm going to pick on Wounded Bull again for like the 50th time in one of these videos, but Wounded Bull is basically kind of like a 2-card 7 or 8, which is mostly above rate in like limited commoner, for instance, like just a very, very solid card. A 2-card 8, however, is very below rate, honestly, at this point in 2025 in Classic Constructed, though. In Living Legend, it gets even worse, where a 2-card 8 is pretty much like unplayable. Like, I don't think you ever see Wounded Bull, maybe in like Iceland or whatever, but like for the most part, I think this card is like borderline not playable in Living Legend. I do want to add a little bit of a power creep disclaimer here. So I think a 2-card 8 was pretty good in the past, but it's a lot less good now just because there are a lot of decks that can just do better numbers than a 2-card 8, like Zen or like Viscerai or like whatever. In a year, this might be out of date, but Wounded Bull might see play in the future, but currently right now it's not seeing any play. I think another important caveat to note when we talk about rate is that we're really talking about the average playable card. So normally when we talk about like doing average, we're not just doing like we're not just like adding the attack value of every card in the game and then dividing by the total number of fab cards, and then that's like basically the going rate of a card. There's probably more complexity to that formula, obviously, but like that's not what we're doing, right? We almost always ignore cards that we know are like bad or strictly worse than existing cards. So like Brutal Assault is like functionally not even a real card in the game. Like it's obviously like draft playable and stuff, but like Ripple Away is just a strictly better card than like Brutal Assault. So like there's no reason to ever like play Brutal Assault over Ripple Away in like a lot of formats where Ripple Away is like legal. So when we really talk about the average card, what we're really talking about is the average playable card, which is slightly above the average card. Caveat number 3 is that cards have additional context. So we have weapons, armor, and hero abilities that can all kind of change the stats on a card. We're going to get to this later in the discussion, but for now we're going to skip over it. I did just kind of want to briefly mention it here just because it is important. I will just kind of talk about this a little bit later. So before we get too deep into the conversation, I did just want to add a quick vocabulary recap here. And I might be using these definitions throughout the kind of presentation. I didn't want anyone to get lost or confused, so we're going to start talking about them a little bit here. So I didn't mention ceiling versus floor yet, but this might come up later in the conversation. So the ceiling is obviously the best case scenario for a card, and the floor is the worst case scenario for a card. This is more kind of geared towards like a value-oriented discussion, so this might not come up, but I did just want to like briefly float this out there in case I do mention it. Next, we talked about value a little bit. So value is just the numbers or benefits that you get from a card depending on the situation. And I did also want to mention here that sometimes you do have to kind of estimate this. So like I kind of put some examples here, like maybe a fealty or a ponder token or a frailty token in a certain situation gives you like a value or whatever. And I think this can like also kind of change depending on the situation, but this is kind of like a rough example of like sometimes we have to like roughly estimate effects where the numerical value is not obvious. Next, we have expected value. So this is how much value you are expecting to get, and this is kind of like when we're talking about Wounding Blow, like the value we expect to get out of Wounding Blow is 4 attack and 3 block. And this might differ from the actual value, like maybe your opponent hits you with like a spider's bite and Wounding Blow can only block for like 2 or whatever. So the actual value can sometimes differ from the expected value. Next, we'll talk about rate. So rate is functionally the value you get based on the cost you pay. So we saw with our Wounding Blow example that we're paying 2 cards to get 8 damage. So that's like the going rate for an attack is we pay 1 card in pitch and we send 1 card in damage and we get 8 value. With Wounding Blow, for instance, we're only paying 1 card to send 4 damage. So rate is basically kind of like a number that the designers of the game roughly attach to what a card should do. And finally, we have our definitions for on rate, below rate, and above rate. So this is basically how cards compare to other cards in the game. So an on rate card is roughly about an average card, a below rate card is below the average card, and an above rate card is above the average card. And again, we kind of talked about a lot of the caveats to that definition, but that's kind of like a functional way that you can kind of use to understand these terms. One important note for the rest of this conversation is this is primarily going to focus on CC, but you could probably create like a similar kind of presentation for like sealed or like different formats or whatever. But CC is obviously like the most popular format in the game, so I wanted to kind of cover that first. To start this conversation, I wanted to kind of focus in on individual cards as opposed to cards within the broader context of like hero abilities and weapons and also like equipment stuff. So for this part, I'm going to basically just kind of walk through like what on, below, and above rate cards look like at each kind of individual category. So when we're talking about analyzing the value of individual cards or the rate of individual cards, I wanted to bring up this Tog formula, as I like to call it. This is, I think, a video that was done by We Make Best. We'll probably like link it like up here or somewhere. But anyways, this Tog formula is really interesting because it basically kind of gives a rough formula for like how to evaluate the value on the card. So we basically have like the max, like the ceiling of the card and the floor of the card. That's kind of like factored into this calculation as well as like the cost to cast the card and conditions that it gives. So like plus if it has an on hit, that adds like a plus some factor or whatever. But basically, he plugs all of these like different kind of parameters into this formula, and it comes up with like a number. And he actually used that number to like try to find the strongest 50 cards in CC. And I think that for the most part, this formula actually works like pretty well. Like if you look, we see like Manifestations of Mirga at the top, which makes sense. We have like Codex as well, Figment of Erudition, Oak and Old. Like these are all like incredibly strong cards. But once you start kind of like going down the list a little bit, you'll kind of start to notice that like some weird cards pop up. So like Tooth and Claw right here is like a pretty interesting example because this is like not a card that normally sees a ton of play in Zen. It can definitely see play, but like not always. We also have like Levels of Enlightenment like way lower than Tooth and Claw, for instance, and Levels is also like an insanely strong card. We also have like Codex of Blood Rot, which is not also seeing a ton of play. So there's definitely a lot of outliers on this list that I would not necessarily say are like the strongest 50 cards in CC, right? But this is just maybe potential outliers of the formula. So I did want to kind of mention that this formula works until it really doesn't. And I think that there are a couple issues that you can kind of highlight with this formula. The first flaw, and the most obvious flaw to me, is how often are we hitting the ceiling versus floor? And like we saw with Tooth and Claw, that managed to get, I think, like in the top 20 or something. But we have to jump through a lot of hoops to enable Tooth and Claw in Zen, right? So we have to like run Strides of Reprisal, we have to run like Harmony Hunt, which generally make it so that the ceiling is much more unachievable than the floor is, obviously. And most of the time, I think with Tooth and Claw, it comes in as like a 0 for 4 or 0 for 5 go again or whatever. But like oftentimes, you're not getting that card draw, which is, I think, what you want a lot of the time. Another flaw for this formula is that for generic or talented cards, we can run those in different heroes, and in different heroes, the ceiling and the floor tend to kind of also be different as well. So with Levels of Enlightenment, for instance, it's significantly better in like Zen or New, because in Zen you can obviously like do like draw go and like pitch the chi to activate Zen and stuff. You can do the same thing in like New and Enigma, but it's a little bit more awkward. Also, New has like Beckoning Mistblade, which allows you to get the Gogan mode, so you can almost always get the draw a card mode on levels. And Enigma doesn't really have that. Like you can obviously pitch to make like a Spectral Shield or whatever, but generally you don't do that super often. So Levels is maybe like a little bit more awkward in Enigma than like Zen and New. The third flaw with this formula is the meta, basically, right? And I think that a lot of the cards are good on paper. Like I think we saw Crippling Crush also kind of breach into the top 50, and Crippling Crush is like a very, very solid card. The problem is that in the current format, there's a ton of armor running around. Like we have most heroes running at least like seven armor, if not more. So Crippling Crush gets a lot worse when there's a lot of armor in the format. And I think that a lot of cards on the list end up being kind of like meta dependent. Like sometimes they're good, but oftentimes, depending on the meta, they're not as good. The fourth potential flaw with this formula is the context the cards are being played in. So We saw Summersfall on the list as well, and Summersfall is amazing into Illusionist, right? You pretty much always all run into Illusionist, but against other heroes, it doesn't really do anything. So Summersfall is obviously an amazing card into Illusionist specifically, but does it warrant being in the top 50 cards of the game? Maybe. It's a decent tech card, obviously, but it's not impressive against like every single hero in the game. So I don't know if that would necessarily breach the top 50 for me. And finally, the fifth flaw that I was able to kind of find with this formula is that it kind of ignores like deck building costs. So this is, I think, kind of similar to hoops or like slightly different, but it's basically like, what are we giving up or what do we have to include in the deck to make our card good? So we kind of touched on like harmony hunts, like having to run harmony hunts with tooth and claws, which again, harmony hunts like a fine card. It's actually like a really good card, but there is definitely like a cost to like cutting like combo cards or like cutting like other cards from your deck. So in general, like you have to consider the cost of including that card in your deck. I think another good example is like Wild Ride and Cast Bones. Like Wild Ride is an amazing card, but you also have to kind of like add in the deck building cost of running a bunch of sixes in KO, which is like relatively free, but kind of a similar thing with like Cast Bones. You also have to consider your like six attack ratio when you're trying to play Cast Bones. So I think the AVR formula is really good at determining the individual value on cards, and I think we saw that like a lot of the powerful cards end up showing in that formula anyways. But what I do want to examine instead is like, how do cards compare to another? Because a lot of the time with the AVR formula, what we're doing is we're comparing apples to oranges. Like we're comparing Oakenold to like Blaze Headlong. And I think that's not really the best way to determine rate on cards. Instead, I think it's more helpful to examine cards within a category of similar cards. So I want to basically compare Go Again cards to Go Again cards. I want to compare Chain Enders to Chain Enders. I want to compare like power cards to power cards. And that's what I kind of wanted to get at with this presentation. So let's go ahead and get into the individual analysis. And I think these are the rough categories of at least how I view Fab cards. There are definitely a lot more categories that I'm not going to touch on here, but these are the broadest and I think the largest categories of cards within Fab. So we have Chain Enders, Go Again attacks, Defense reacts, Block cards, Attack reacts, Non-attack pumps, Arcane Damage, pitch cards, and power cards. And these are what I'm going to try to cover in this conversation. So let's start off with these zero-cost Chain Enders. And I think I've tried to pick some above-average zero-cost Chain Enders just so that we can kind of look at them here. So I think for a below-rate zero-cost Chain Ender, what you're really looking at is a 0 for 4 with no upside. So Wounding Blow, for instance, doesn't really see a lot of competitive play, even though it's a very good static card. In general, there are just better cards that do the same thing that Wounding Blow does. Like, at generic, Snatch does the same thing that Wounding Blow does, but it's generic instead, and it also draws you a card. So, obviously, a below rate kind of Chain Ender is mostly like a 4 attack with no upside. When we look at kind of like an on rate Chain Ender, there are a couple that I think see play. So like Searing Shot sees play as just a 0 for 4 with an on hit deal 1 damage, which is real sad. So this can sometimes turn into like a 0 for 5. Similar thing with like Static Shock also kind of being functionally like a 0 for 5. That also kind of like requires you to play a lightning card. And then we also have kind of like Lava Burst, which is also kind of like a 0 for 5, sometimes even a 0 for 6, depending. Arcanic Shockwave, also kind of a similar effect. So I would consider all of these to be pretty on-rate Chain Enders. Generally, what you're looking for in a zero-cost Chain Ender is roughly 5 damage, and how you get that 5 damage is maybe kind of spread out. Now let's talk about above rate Chain Enders. So I think if you get +4 attack plus a really good on hit, I think that kind of constitutes an above rate Chain Ender. So Leave No Witness is a very powerful assassin card. You basically get to, if it hits, you basically get to banish an arsenal, and banishing an arsenal is worth like, I think 3 to 4 points generally, just because you're losing a card, and a card in general is worth 3 points. And then if you lose an arsenal, I think an arsenal is generally seen as better than a card in hand. So you're losing maybe like 4 points. So this makes Leave No Witness like an 8 value card if you attack with it, potentially, assuming that it hits. Snatch also kind of has a similar stat line to Leave No, where it's 0 for 4 that on hit draws a card, and drawing a card is worth roughly 3 values. So you get roughly a 0 for 7 if you hit with this card. So I consider these to be somewhere between like on and above rate. Like these cards are all, I think all these cards are probably like slightly above rate, but these cards are kind of like more like middling than Snatch and Leave No Witnesses. Moving on to our 1-cost Chain Enders. So for these cards, I kind of picked out some of the better 1-cost Chain Enders. So we have like Art of Dragonfire, Maul and Key, Censor, Death Touch, Miraging Metamorph, and Tremor of Earthal. That's a joke. Tremor of Earthal is here as a joke, by the way. But it is technically like a good static card if you manage to get the condition off. But let's use Tremor of Earthal kind of as an example of maybe a below rate card. So Tremor of Earthal is basically a 1 for 4 that sometimes gets a +2, but the condition on getting the +2 is often kind of rough, and it also kind of blocks for 2, which means that this card is like pretty below rate. I don't think this card has like ever seen legitimate play in Classic Constructed. But also one of my favorite cards because I think it's really cool. Next, let's kind of cover on-rate cards. So I think I would consider like Maul and Key and Art of Dragonfire to be like pretty on rate. Same thing with like Death Touch. Like these are all like somewhere between like on to above rate. I think these are probably some of the better examples. But Art of Dragonfire is a 1 for 5 that can sometimes be a 1 for 7, which is really good. Same thing with Maul and Key. It's a 1 for 5 that on hit can deal an extra damage, so it's sometimes a 1 for 6. Also has the combo keyword going for it. And Death Touch is a 1 for 6 that's a little bit restrictive, being that you can only play it from hand, but it has a very powerful effect and a very powerful on hit. Same thing with Miraging Metamorph. So Miraging Metamorph is a 1 for 7 that also has the kind of downside of having Phantasm. So they basically kind of like added one or two stats onto it to just make it a little bit better. So these are all chain enders that I kind of consider to be on rate, just having a very like powerful effect and going a little bit above the 1 for 5 with no upside kind of stat line. Next, let's talk about above rate cards. So I would consider like Censor and Miraging Metamorph and Death Touch to be kind of almost a little bit more above rate. Censor is obviously a very strong card, just being a 1 for 5 3 block that also has a sometimes devastating on hit, especially into certain decks. So Censor is obviously a very, very solid card. Same thing with like Death Touch and Metamorph. Like these are both pretty solid chain enders, and I could consider these almost to be going a little bit above rate, depending on the hero or like the matchup you play into it. But a lot of it kind of depends. Yeah, so these are all the 1 cost chain enders that I consider to be like pretty good. So I think most of these are above rate except for Tremor, obviously. But like these cards are all like quite solid in their own right, and I think some of them are maybe like a little bit more above rate than others. Like I think Malenki is like a pretty on rate card, but these are all like I think very solid, just examples of 1 cost chain enders. Next, let's move on to the 2 cost chain enders. So there's not a ton of actually 2 cost chain enders. Like the higher in cost you get, the normally the less cards there are in the card pool. But let's kind of go through them here. So below rate is what I would consider to be a 2 cost 6 attack with no upside. So I think there's maybe an example of like For the Emperor, or I think one of those cards from like the recent set in the Hunted, where I think it's just like on attack make a fealty or whatever. And I consider to be that card like kind of like a 2 for 6 with very little upside, if any. So that's what you're kind of looking at when you're looking at like a below rate card. For an on-rate card, you're generally looking to get like 6 attack, like +1 or 2 damage. So like I think Swing Big used to be like a pretty above rate card, just because you're above the normal 2 for 6 rate. But Swing Big is kind of like not even that far above rate. Like it's maybe like 1 or 2 points above rate. It's still a very solid card, but not like super far above rate than like I think a lot of the other 2 cost chain enders. Similar thing with like Key Unleash. Like Key Unleash is like a two card 7 basically, which is pretty all right in like Zen, for instance, but like not even like sometimes even this effect is like kind of getting cut from Zen. So I would consider these cards to be like pretty on rate, or a little bit more on rate than kind of the rest of the cards here. Next, we have the above rate cards. So CNC is a very above rate card, even though it doesn't really look like it, just because the effect is very powerful. You're basically getting a super relevant disruption effect on a 6 attack, which makes it really good. It blocks 3 and also has the defense reaction kind of clause on it, which makes it very solid. Similar card in Weakest Link, which has basically identical stat line to Command and Conquer, but it has the discard without base power card, right? Which makes it really solid. And then similar thing with Erase Face. Like these are all very disruptive effects that see a lot of play just because of how relevant disruption is in the format. Another similar card down here is Battering Bolt. So discard all cards other than action cards. This can be pretty devastating against some decks as well, so Battering Bolt also ends up seeing a lot of play. And yeah, these I think are the main kind of like disruptive cards that I would consider to be like above rate 2 cost chain enders, and I think that's generally what you want to look for in a 2 cost chain ender, is some disruption to basically end the turn on that makes your opponent like give you cards from hand. I think that's kind of like the key power of a lot of these cards here. Next, let's talk about our 3 cost chain enders. So we have Cut Through Facade, Honest Touch, Woundable, and then I've also kind of lumped these in with Guardian cards, basically, because those are the cards that kind of have the highest cost in the game. So in general, there's not a ton of like 4 costs at generic. So it seems like most of those are kind of like Guardian cards. So let's talk about below rate 3 cost attack. So normally what you're looking for in below rate 3 cost chain ender is like a 7 attack with like no upside. So I don't know if this card actually exists in the game. Tegan can maybe like pull it up if there is a card like this, but in general, I don't think this effect is actually like actually like printed anywhere. Yeah, but in general, I don't think there really exists a below rate 3 cost chain ender, just because most of them I think have like an additional effect. Next, let's talk about on rate. So Autumn's Touch I think is a pretty on rate card. It's just a 3 for 7 3 block that also has the Earth kind of staple to it, which makes it like maybe like a pretty decent synergy card, or at least I think it's all play in like Starvo and stuff. So Autumn's Touch definitely a pretty solid card. We also have Wounded Bull, which kind of fits a kind of similar role. Wounded Bull is not seeing a ton of play just because having a 2-card 8 is not necessarily the best thing anymore, just because of how fast the game is. But in general, like Wounded Bull has gotten has seen play in the past just because it has a really, very good stat line of a 2-card 8 basically, which makes it pretty good. Next we have our above rate cards. So I think this normally kind of encapsulates cards that have like an on hit. So like I think if you're getting like 7 attack plus an on hit, you're getting like a pretty above rate 3 cost card. So I think one of the cards that comes to mind is like Cut Through the Facade here, which basically says it can't be defended by auras, and on hit you can destroy an aura. This card also like doesn't really see a ton of play, so maybe it's not even above rate, maybe it's like on rate. Blanche I think is another card that I think did see play at one point. Being a 3 for 7 that can like turn off the color of cards, which sometimes matters into like the Mystic Heroes and stuff. So that card I think did see play, but in general, you need to have like a pretty strong effect to warrant being a 3 cost that's included in your deck. And also here, I've kind of included some Guardian cards because I think that they kind of fall into this similar kind of stat line where we have like Chokeslam, Spinal Crush, and Pulverize. I think these are like some of the best Guardian cards. Like they basically are coming in like 4 for 8, 5 for 9. Pulverize is not even really that good of a card if I'm being honest. Like it's kind of bad, but it has seen play in the past just because of like fatigue purposes. In general, like Guardian cards tend to be pretty below rate, but we might see that change in the future with the release of the new Guardian set. Next, let's move on to our Gogan cards. So we have a bunch of cards that here as examples. For our below rate cards, generally what you're kind of looking for is a 2 to 3 attack with no upside. So I think there are cards like this that exist in the game, like Head Jab, for instance. Head Jab does have like some weird kind of like combo upside, but in general, it's for the most part like a 0 for 3. Go again with no upside, right? For our more on-rate cards, what we're really looking for is like 3 to 4 attack plus maybe some synergy here. And maybe like a more on-rate card has like a harder restriction than an above-rate card. So an example of an on-rate card might be like 100 Winds. I think 100 Winds is like pretty on-rate. You do get like 3 to 4 attack, and you also get the added synergy. It might even be bordering on above rate, just because you sometimes get that additional like +1 effect. But for the most part, in a vacuum, 100 Winds is like a pretty on-rate card, I think. Similar thing to kind of like Rune Ranger Swarm. I'd argue Rune Ranger Swarm is like actually above rate in like decks like Viscerai, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But on paper, Rune Ranger Sword is also like a pretty on-rate card. Just having a 0 for 3 that has like conditional go again, the blocks 3 is a pretty good kind of effect. So next, let's talk about above-rate cards. And these are normally for attack with a pretty non-restrictive condition. So I think the best examples that come to mind here are like Cut Through from the new set. Most of the time, this is a 0 for 4 with go again. Because it's very easy to normally attack with a dagger, like specifically in decks like Ira. So this card is definitely a powerhouse in kind of like those decks. Blaze Headlong, also a pretty big powerhouse in like Syndra, for instance, just because you get a Draconic attack that almost always has go again. So these cards have like pretty non-restrictive effects that also come in for 4 attack, which makes them really good. Similar thing with like Flittering Charge. This card sees play in like Acilio, I think also Aurora as well. So Flittering Charge is just very good just because it has a pretty non-restrictive effect, just getting go again whenever you play an instant, and the deck has a ton of instants, so you get go again on this pretty often. Scar for Scar, I think, is maybe on the border between like on rate and above rate, but I think it's actually more above rate in my opinion, just because that you can pretty often kind of control your life total to the point where you might get this to turn on, and a lot of times having just a 0 for 4 go again with a kind of non-restrictive condition is like pretty good. That being said, I think it's a little bit more restrictive than like Cut Through or Blaze Headlong, for instance, but I think it's still like a pretty decent card. Now let's talk about our 1-cost go again. So normally when you're looking at a 1-cost go again, I think below rate 1-cost go again is like a 4 attack with no upside. In general, go again is like a really strong ability, so even that might see play depending on like what the card is. But in general, that's probably what you want to look for. For an on-rate card, what I'd kind of expect is more like 4 attack plus synergy. So like Spinning Wheel Kick is a pretty good example here. Just being like a combo card is pretty good. Most of the text on Spinning Wheel Kick like doesn't matter, but the combo keyword does matter a lot. And coming in as a 1 for 4 with Gogan is a pretty decent stat line, although it's not like amazing. It's actually to the point where a lot of decks cut the stat line just because it's not like the best thing in the world. Poison Blade also has like a pretty similar stat line, where it kind of is like a 1 for 4, 1 for 5 sometimes. Kind of depends on like how much dagger synergy you have and stuff. But I think Poison Blade is like maybe even above rate depending on like how you build it. But in general, like in limited at least, like Poison Blade I think is like somewhere between a bad and a good card. Like somewhere between on rate and above rate. Next, let's talk about our above rate cards. So these are cards where we get 4 attack plus go again plus maybe like a synergy or an additional point of damage. So I think Mark with Maga and Demonstrate Devotion are both like pretty above rate 1 costs, just because they both make like a Mark token or a fealty token, basically the same thing in Syndra. But like Mark is a little bit more delayed, so you get like an extra block here. But these are both like pretty good examples of like a 1 cost of Gogan that have like an additional effect, which makes these cards like I think pretty strong, at least in like limited or in CC. I think they're also like semi decent if Redline Syndra wasn't like a deck. We also have Looking for Scrap. Looking for Scrap is a card that sees play in a lot of like assassin decks just because they have a lot of 1 cost that they can banish from the graveyard. I think it also sees play in Ira sometimes, but this card's really solid just because you get the 1 for 5 Gogan stat line, which makes it really good. We also have Spirits of Sorelli, which is a card that sees play and into decks that don't have a lot of poppers. This is basically just an unconditional 1 for 5 Gogan, which makes it a really powerful kind of like damage card for like Enigma, for instance. So yeah, these are all kind of cards that I consider to be like somewhere on the cusp between on and above rate. And in general, I think these cards are all like pretty solid in their own right. Let's move on to our 2 cost Gogan. So 2 cost Gogan is actually kind of a category that's pretty empty of cards. There's not a ton of cards that kind of fall into this category, but we'll kind of try to talk about them here. So I'd consider Zealous Belting to kind of be on the edge of like between below and on rate. I think the card's pretty good because you get to like maybe potentially swing like an Othos if you're like a Guardian or whatever. But in general, like 5 into 6 is not like a super above rate combo, especially if you're spending like three cards to do that. What I would consider to be more on rate is like Wild Ride and Surging Strike. So Surging Strike, most of the time you actually like use Heart and Cross Trap and cast this for 0, but having like a 2-card 5 is pretty okay as a stat line. Wild Ride is also like a 2-card 6, but you get the added discard randomness, and you also can't block with it, which makes it a little bit worse just because you can't block with it, and also has like some RNG elements. I think Dread Screamer also kind of falls into the category of being like a pretty on-rate card. You have like the banish ability, and you get the Gogan, but I think for the most part, Dread Screamer is like pretty on-rate, somewhere between on-rate and above rate. I think the most above rate 2 cost Gogan is Shadow Realm Horror, just being a pretty good synergy card for Levia that also has the additional banish synergy, and you can also potentially get a high roll and like play a card from banish. This is probably the most above rate 2 cost with Gogan that I think I found. Moving right along to defense reactions, and I tried to do my best to kind of fit as much as I could of this all in one slide, but it's a little bit difficult just because there's a lot of defense reaction in the game, or like pseudo defense reactions, so we're going to kind of do our best to talk about it here. So in this table here, I've kind of put below rate, on rate, and above rate as like the kind of categories, and then the costs are at the top. So if you want an example of a 0 cost that's below rate, what we look to is this kind of square here where we're kind of looking at like 3 blocks. So I think a below rate 0 cost is basically like Evasive Leap. It's basically a 3 block with no upside that kind of like doesn't do anything. Moving on to kind of like our more above rate or on rate defense reactions, we can see like a 3 block with upside. So I think an example of this might be like Inertia Trap or like Frailty Trap, depending on like how much value you get out of the Inertia or Frailty. Generally, these are like 3 blocks with a little bit of upside, which makes them pretty good. And I think for our above rate defense reactions, what we're really looking at are 4 blocks with upside. So I think I've got a couple of good examples here with Rootbound Carabus. So this is a excellent synergy card that's also modal, so you can either have it come in for 3 or come in for +1. And it also gives you Decompose, which is a very powerful ability in Earth Heroes. We also have Sink Below, which is a incredibly above rate reaction. Just being a generic that lets you filter your hand is probably one of the best effects in the game. Just a very, very solid card. And finally, we have a newest addition from the Hunted, which is Shelter from the Storm, which has kind of like a modality to it where you can either use the 0 for 4 mode or the prevention mode. And I think this kind of warrants it being included in the more above rate cards. I've also kind of illustrated some examples of the 1, 2, and 3 cost D-reacts here, but what I want to kind of point your attention to is I don't think that there are actually a ton of above rate defense reactions that are greater than 0 cost, right? So we have Steel Blade Shunt, which is probably like the best example of a 1 cost block react. I actually don't know. There might be more 1 cost reacts that I missed, but in general, I think Steel Blade Shunt is like the best 1 cost react. So 1 cost, you're coming in for 6, and then you get maybe a potential additional value. So this card also like doesn't see a ton of play, which makes it kind of weird because if a card is not seeing play, it's kind of hard to kind of determine that to be a above rate card. Similar thing with like Staunch and Unmovable. Those cards are also not seeing a ton of play right this second, but I think they are like pretty on rate cards. I just wouldn't kind of classify them as above rate here. I think there are some examples of like two cost and 3 cost reacts that are like pretty below rate. Like I think there's some weird like Guardian rares from like Dynasty or some stuff. Yeah, but in general, I don't think that there are actually a ton of above rate reactions that are greater than 0 cost. A similar category to defense reactions is block cards, which is kind of a newer card type in the game. And I'd consider block cards to be kind of a little bit difficult to evaluate just because sometimes they're actually like a lot worse than they really seem. But for block cards, below rate block cards, I think you're getting like 4 block to 3 to 4 block with like no upside. So like Testamite, I think, is a pretty good example of this. This is a card that does not see play because it has the Clash ability, which means that it anti-synergizes with itself, which means that if you reveal a Testamite off a Testamite, you're like losing the Testamite, which makes it kind of like not an ideal card. So it's basically just a 4 block here. For a more on-rate card, we can kind of look at like Firewall and Unforgetting Unforgiving, for example. For the most part, I think Unforgetting and Unforgiving doesn't trigger a lot, so I'm kind of including that in this kind of like conversation. But Firewall also doesn't have like a super huge upside. So in general, I think that these 2 cards are like pretty good examples of like on-rate block cards. You're basically just getting a red 4 block, which is kind of whatever. Next, we have our above-rate block cards, and I want to kind of touch on Haunting Rendition and Tiger Eye Reflex as an example. So Haunting Rendition is a 4 block red that also has kind of like some modality to it, so you can use it to basically like discard it and create a rune chant, which makes it like a very, very solid, flexible card. Haunting Rendition, I think, is a very above rate card. Similar thing with like Tiger Eye Reflex. I think Tiger Eye Reflex also is like pretty above rate. Tiger Eye Reflex is a little bit deceptive because it's a yellow 3 block, which makes it kind of like seem kind of mid. But creating a Crouching Tiger is such a strong effect that it might even be like basically worth like 2 damage sometimes ish. That's kind of what I kind of estimate a Crouching Tiger to be. So Tiger Eye Reflex, paradoxically enough, is actually like I think an above rate block card. And in the bottom here, we also have Canopy Shelter, which is a blue 2 block earth card, which when it defends creates a might token. So baseline, this is blue getting you 3 value, and then in some decks like Florian, you can actually get like 4 value out of this, which makes it, I think, a very above rate block card. Now let's move on to our attack reacts. So I've also kind of created a table for this slide because it's kind of hard to illustrate because there's not a ton of like attack reacts in the game, but I'll kind of do my best here. So for a below rate attack react, what you're really looking for is like maybe like +2 or +3 with not like a really relevant ability. For a more on rate kind of attack react, which are most attack reacts going to fall into the on rate category, but Iron Song Response is like a pretty good example. So you get like 0 for 3 with a little bit of like conditionality to it, which makes it potentially like risky, but also like a very powerful effect. I think Blistering Blade is also like a very on-rate card, just being a 0 for 2 or 3 Draconic card that can help turn on like Obsidian Fire Veins, for instance. Blistering Blade is like a pretty good card in Fang, so I consider this to be like pretty on rate. And then I think not pictured here is like an above rate attack react. So I think that like Hunt's End is maybe an example of an above rate attack react, just coming in as like a 0 for 4 with like that additional kind of like requirement that you have for 3 fealties. Makes that card pretty good, and I'd consider that card to be like an above rate 0 cost attack react. And I think there are a lot of other examples of 0 costs that kind of just couldn't fit into the slide. Like I think Razor's Edge is also really good. There's a ton of them in the game, so I just wasn't able to kind of fit them all on one slide. All right, next let's talk about our 1 costs. So I think a good example of a above to on rate 1 cost is like Jagged Edge here. So basically we're giving a weapon +3 and damage can't be prevented, which is sometimes a pretty strong effect, but otherwise is like a pretty on rate card. Venomous Bite here is a good example kind of an above rate one cost card. So basically you're getting like a 1 for 4 here or like a really good effect. I think Singing Steel Blade is also a good example of a one cost attack react, just because that often comes in as like a 1 for 4 if you tutor for Iron Song response. So in general, I think an above rate attack react is like a one cost that comes in for like 4, has like a really good effect, and comes in for 3. Yeah, for 2 cost, there's not a lot of attack reacts in the game, but I think the staple 2 cost attack react is Pummel here. So Pummel just being a +4 that also provides an on hit, which makes it a very, very powerful card. We also have in the 2 cost slot, there are some like +3 effects from like Welcome to Wraith that are not like incredibly impressive. So I've kind of lumped those into like the below rate category. But like if you're getting like +3 or +4, it's like still pretty below rate. Yeah, so I had to update the slide a little bit, but I think for like our 2 cost reacts, a more on rate like 2 cost react is basically like 4 to 5 pump ish. Like I think we have like Fatal Engagement and also like Route, for instance. So I consider those to be like roughly 4 or 5 values. So I consider those to be probably like more on rate attack reacts. I did want to actually note here that there are greater than 2 cost attack reacts like Overpower, but I think Overpower might actually be the only one. So after a certain point, you basically get to the point where you're kind of running out of cards to compare to. But Overpower is probably like on rate for what it is, just being a three cost for functionally 4 or 6 buff. Moving on to non-tech buffs, and for this slide, I had a little bit of difficulty kind of categorizing them, so I just wanted to kind of give a general rule of thumb here. I think most 0 cost buffs do see some amount of play in the game. So like Lace with Blood Rot sees play, Saber Bloodshed seems to play. Toxicity, I think somewhat sees play. I've kind of roughly categorized it in here as being a buff, but these are all like I think pretty good examples. I think Runic Reckoning you can also consider to be like a +3 or +4 value. So I think these are all pretty good examples of like 0 costs that end up seeing a bit of play. Next we have 1 cost, and I think 1 costs generally try to come in for 4, but there are some like notable 1 costs that still see play even if they're like +3. So like Warrior's Valor I think still sees play in like Dawnblade Dory, which makes it like kind of interesting because I think like a lot of buffs just end up seeing play even if they're kind of like quote unquote below rate. But normally what you probably want to expect from 1 cost is like +4 or some additional effect on it to make it a little bit better than a +3. And there's also not a ton of 2 cost buffs, so I didn't end up like making a table here, but I think the only like 2 cost buff that I could roughly put in this category is like Exploding Aether, which at red comes in for amp 3, and this doesn't really see play, so I don't know. There are also some like Guardian Auras that like buff that also don't see a ton of play, but in general, you maybe expect just a little bit more than like your 1 cost and 0 cost buffs. Let's talk about Arcane Damage. So Arcane Damage is an interesting type because for the most part, it's designed to be fundamentally below its attack action counterparts when you compare like the damage numbers, right? So because Arcane Damage is so hard to prevent, one of the things that these designers of the game did was make it so that the numbers of the cards are all just like a point or 2 worse, basically. So for the most part, I don't think that LSS is necessarily printed an above rate Arcane Damage card, unless you want to count that it's above rate for other Arcane Damage cards, which you could definitely make the argument for. But I think for the most part, like all Arcane Damage spells are kind of just like on rate, just because of how kind of careful they've been with the spells. There may be a couple like below rate cards that just like don't have an effect. Like maybe our Zap here is pretty bad when you compare it to like Sap or whatever, but for the most part, like most of these are just kind of like on rate filler cards, just because the wizard card pool is not super kind of developed. And I did want to mention here that we will kind of touch on Aether Wildfire and Blazing Aether later, and I don't think that those cards really fall into the kind of rate paradigm that I'm talking about here. Next, let's move on to pitch cards. So in general, for most non-redline decks, you do have some number of cards that you want to kind of use in the deck for pitch, or just to have like maybe like some late game potential. And most of the time, these cards are not intended to necessarily be played, but rather cards that can have like late game synergy or value potential, or like synergy with the deck, or just like a card that you can play if you need to, like in an emergency. So most blue cards just in general have like -2 stats from their red counterparts. Like Our Desire Mind has like 2 less stats from Our Desire Body. And yellow cards in general have -1 stat from the red counterparts as well. So when you compare Our Desire Body to Our Desire Soul, you'll see that Our Desire Soul has like 1 less stat. And this is pretty true for like most cards in the game where they have like a rainbow kind of printing. Like Harmony Hunt has 1 less stat than like yellow Harmony Hunt, and 1 less stat than like red Harmony Hunt. And for the most part, blue cards are cards that you want to ideally pitch, but if you have to play them in a pinch, you kind of want them to not be too bad. So, like Terra Sunder, I think is a good example here. Just being a blue 3 block that you can sometimes staple onto an attack makes it a pretty strong card. Macho and Wrecker Romp are both kind of like synergy cards, one for Brute and one for Guardian. Just having a 8 attack can turn on like effects like Rouse the Ancients, and having Wrecker Romp in your deck can also turn on effects like your Wild Ride, draw, discard, and stuff like that. So basically, what you want your blues in your deck to do is basically like try to block if you end up having like an all blue hand, and you want them to have like late game synergies or synergies that if you need to play a blue in a pinch, they can end up being pretty good. And the final category that I wanted to kind of end on here is power cards, and I think power cards kind of fall outside the kind of rate discussion a little bit, so I wanted to kind of segment them into their own little category. So for certain cards in the game, there are several leagues above rate than like what a normal card in that category would be. And I refer to these cards as kind of like power cards. So cards which, when you see them, they often kind of like change the course of the game, or are very limited or restricted in kind of like deck building or like cost to them. And most power cards generally have like specialization or like legendary attached to them, or have some kind of like setup that you need to do to make the card work. So I think I have a couple examples here, like Channel Lightning Valley is kind of like a draw to a lot of the time. Just a very, very solid card, but you do have to like put in some work to kind of make this hit, which can sometimes mean it's not like as good as you want it to be, but still just a very, very powerful card. We also have like Manifestations of Mirror Guy over here. This card oftentimes is a 3 for 8 go again that also boards for, which is like super far above like any other like aura in like Enigma, for instance. Next, we also have Aether Wildfire, which I told you we'd kind of come back to Aether Wildfire. I think that Aether Wildfire is more so a power card than it is just like a on rate or like above rate arcane damage card. Like Aether Wildfire is like the reason you play Kano, right? So I wouldn't consider this to be like, this is obviously an above rate card. Like all of these are kind of like obviously above rate cards. But this is more so kind of classified, for me at least, as like a power card, which kind of falls outside of like the comparison you can make to other cards, right? Because this is one of the most powerful cards in the game. Similar thing with kind of Red Ledger down here. So it's a 1 for 5, which kind of follows the similar stat line to the 1 for 5 Chain Enders, but this one has a devastating on hit where if you hit with it, you basically your opponent can only play one action, which against some decks is like absolutely brutal. Codex of Frailty, also just an insane card. Baseline, it's like a 0 for 4 because you can get like a Leave No Witness off it or something. Sometimes this is also like recurs like a CNC, and like you can send a CNC, and like there's a lot of disgusting things you can do with Codex of Frailty. It's probably one of the better cards in the game. So obviously Codex of Frailty I think kind of falls more into like the power card category as opposed to like a non-attack like buff or whatever. Like it's more so of a power card than anything else. And finally on this side, I wanted to briefly kind of touch on Felling. So Felling is a 3 for 8 that also bottoms a card from your opponent. So it's kind of like a 3 card 11 that blocks 3 and is also an earth card. So Felling of the Crown I'd also consider to be kind of more of a power card than just like an on rate 3 cost card. So I also have the second slide for power cards, and I kind of mentioned this before, but I tried to kind of segment power cards away from like normal cards because they're outliers basically, right? If you're trying to compare like Bonds of Agony to like an Art of Desire Mind, like the comparison is not really good, right? Because you're comparing like a 0 for 4 attack to like a 0 for 1 react that also maybe gives you a life or whatever. Like Bonds of Agony is basically like leagues outside what a normal blue should do. So it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges to compare power cards to just like their normal kind of like rare or majestic counterparts. And I think there are a lot of cards like this in the game. Obviously, Zentir Repurpose is kind of like a meme up here, but like maybe you should probably replace this with like Chi or something. Like Chi I'd consider also to be kind of like a power card. So there's a ton of power cards in the game, and I think that it's not super helpful to compare these cards to their more like on rate and above rate counterparts. So we've kind of taken a look at cards at kind of like more of an individual basis where we've compared similar cards kind of to each other. But what I want to do now is try to put cards into context, which is kind of like the title of the slide, and kind of give some additional context to cards. So maybe some equipment, some hero abilities, and some weapons that maybe make certain cards better than they kind of seem on paper. And the main idea I kind of want to highlight in this part is that the rate of a card can change. And this can change based on a variety of factors like hero power, equipment, and kind of like weapons and stuff. So let's go ahead and get into some examples. So I think a good example to kind of illustrate this is Rune Rager's Swarm and Viscerai. So Rune Rager's Swarm, I think, is a card that we discussed earlier, is about on rate or maybe even slightly above rate just because it blocks 3. But Rune Rager Sword and Viscerai is actually like significantly above rate, just because if you play it after playing a non-attack card, you're basically generating a rune chant, which is really, really good. Now, this rune chant you can kind of divide between the two cards. So, like, maybe if you play Malefic and you play Rune Rager Storm, maybe you're getting like half a rune chant or whatever on Rune Rager Storm. But the more cards you have, like the more spread out that value gets. So you can basically maybe get like 4/5 of rune chant or kind of something like that, which makes Rune Rager Storm basically like a 0 for 4 Gogan, which makes it really, really good. Next up, we got another example. So let's talk about CNC and Ira. So this is adding a little bit more context here. We basically have Ira's hero power, but we also have Kadachi. So these two cards will basically allow us to pump CNC to +7, which is a lot more annoying than it coming in for 6. So this is kind of like a way that the rate of a single card like CNC, if we just pitch like a blue to CNC and it comes in for 6, it's obviously not as good as coming in for 1 +7, which is significantly better. The next example I have here is one we've kind of briefly touched on before with Wild Ride, which I think we mentioned kind of in our Gogan section. But in KO specifically, if we discard a 6 to Wild Ride and we create a Might token, really functionally Wild Ride is coming in as a 2 for 7, which is a very good rate, especially with a Gogan card. For my final example here, I want to kind of illustrate how the Syndra engine can basically add a ton of value onto cards. So this is almost like a 4-card combo. So basically with like Mask of Momentum, Flick Knives, Kunai, and the hero ability itself. What we can basically do is, because Flick Knives is always in play, we can basically add an extra damage anytime we play an attack, which is really, really solid. What we can do with Mask of Momentum and Flick Knives specifically is that we can basically use Flick Knives to threaten card draw twice on the combat chain, which is really, really powerful. So let's kind of take this example of like Fire Titan Strike Fist plus Blaze Headlong plus Ravenous Rabble. And let's say we have like our full equipment suite here. What we can do with the Fire Titan Strike Fist is lead off on that and then attack with like Blaze Headlong for 5, which is a really solid breakpoint. And then our Ravenous Rabble, if we reveal right on the top, which in more Redline Cinder builds we do most of the time anyways, we're basically coming in for 4, and now we have the on-hit of Snatch, basically, right? So drawing a card is worth roughly about 3 values, so if we are able to get mass value that turn, we're basically adding, like, stapling, like, 3 value onto this. And then we also get the additional 1 value from Kunai just for attacking in the first place, right? So this makes Syndra, like, a very powerful hero. And if let's say our opponent blocks on Ravenous Rabble, and then we're able to have, like, another attack here that I kind of didn't put, but let's say we have another attack after Ravenous Rabble, that attack can also have the Snatch on hit depending on how our opponent blocks. So this means that we're basically adding an additional draw card plus 1 damage onto our entire combat chain, which is really, really powerful, especially in a very aggressive deck like Syndra. So these Draconic cards actually have a lot more value than just the numbers on the card, even though the numbers on the card are already like at a baseline very, very good. For the final part here, I want to kind of just go over some cards that I think are a little bit tough to evaluate. I put a couple on the slide here, but there are a lot of cards in this game that do not numerically evaluate super well, and a lot of it kind of depends on the situation. Like these are kind of some good examples. But there are a lot of cards in the game that are kind of tough to evaluate, and I kind of want to do my best to kind of break down how you can potentially try to evaluate cards. So Tegan actually kind of suggested this slide, and I wanted to kind of talk about how much an opt is worth, because I think Aether Spindle is actually a very good example of a card that I think is a little bit tough to evaluate on paper. So when we compare Aether Spindle to like another card like Voltic Bolt, we're basically losing out on 1 damage, but we do get this on-hit Opt X, which is really powerful. But how do we evaluate on-hit Opt X? We obviously know that this effect is like very strong in Kano, because like if we pump with like Crucible of Aetherweave, we're basically sending this for 5, whereas Voltic, we're sending it for 6 or whatever. So on its surface, it's like a below rate card, right? It's a 2 for 4, which is not great. But if we add Crucible of Aetherweave kind of into that mix, we're basically pumping to a 2 for 5, which is a lot better. And Aether Spindle basically opts for every point of Arcane. So if we hit Foley with Aether Spindle, let's say it comes in for 5, we deal 5 damage, we opt 5. That's a very powerful effect, because in Kano that means that we can like basically set up our next turn, and we know what the top card of our deck is, and all 4 cards that we're drawing into, which can be very powerful if the cards on top of our deck are good. If the cards on top of our deck are bad, we might have to like bottom all of them, and then Aether Spindle gets a lot less good. But the effect on Aether Spindle is also like very threatening. So one other thing that our opponent could do, instead of taking 5 from Spindle, what they could do is they could like pay 3 and AP3, And in that case, what we're doing is we're basically discarding a blue from their hand or forcing them to pitch a blue. And then it comes in for deal 2 damage, op 2, which is also a pretty strong effect. So Aether Spindle has a kind of interesting choice for your opponent to make. Either they have to let you deal 5 damage, or they have to uh, pay with a blue, which is in general one of the better cards in the hand, unless they have multiple blues in hand. And in that case, you're potentially taking them off of like a very powerful turn on their next turn. So this variance in what your opponent can do can make it a little bit tough to evaluate Aether Spindle, but both the choices are kind of rough for your opponent, which makes Aether Spindle just a very, very solid card in Kano and one of the kind of like better cards in the deck. Next, let's talk about tokens. So tokens are a little bit rough to evaluate, but I wanted to kind of break down how we can evaluate tokens, because a lot of effects are like pretty similar. Like you might have a 1 for 4 with Gogan that makes a token, and then like another 1 for 4 with Gogan that makes like a different token. So how do you like compare and contrast those cards? That's kind of what I wanted to try to cover in this section. So I think some tokens are relatively easy to evaluate. Like you have all these tokens right here, right? And for the most part, all of these give you like 1-ish value. Like Rune Chance and Might tokens give you about 1 value. Spellbane Aegis is a Spell Void 1, so it gives you about 1 value. Courage Token gives you +1 value. Spectral Shield gives you Ward 1, which is sometimes 1 value, sometimes not 1 value. And then Frailty Token, if you activate a weapon or you play a card from Arsenal, it also gives you like 1 value. And then similar thing with like Blood Red Fox, except it gives you 2 values. So a lot of these cards that have like a very numerical number that you can like put on them, these cards are like pretty easy to evaluate, but there are some tougher tokens in the game that I think that are worth kind of looking at in terms of trying to evaluate them. So a Fealty Token is a new token from the Hunted that I think a lot of people had a lot of trouble evaluating in the beginning, and we can kind of try to do our best here. So we have this effect, Display of Loyalty, and this is a 0 for 3 head jab. Notably, it does block 2, so it probably has like a pretty decent upside, and this card definitely does because it's a Draconic with Go Again. So baseline, that's already pretty good, right? Because you're getting a Draconic attack with Go Again. And then when this attacks hero, create a Fealty. And a Fealty is like a pretty decent token, honestly, like a pretty above average token. And what it does is it basically turns something into Draconic. But like, how do we assign like a numerical value to a Fealty? Because sometimes like a Fealty does nothing, right? Like you might not be able to use it during the game, or it might not give you any value. But you can kind of use like Art of Dragonfire as like a gauge of how much this effect is worth. So Art of Dragonfire, when this attacks, if it's Draconic, deal 2 damage to any target. So if you are able to use like a Fealty, which is normally the way you make Art of Dragonfire Draconic, if you use a Fealty here, you're basically getting +2 damage. So if you want to divide the damage you're dealing between these two cards, you'll basically get like +1 here and then +1 here. So realistically, Display Loyalty ends up being like a 0 for 4 a lot of the time. It's just kind of split up a little bit weird because you have this Fealty token, which is kind of like a payoff later, right? And Fealty is not always worth 1. I'm just kind of demonstrating in this situation that it can be worth 1, and then sometimes it even can be worth like a lot more value. Like let's say we turn this Draconic and then we buy back a dagger and like flick it or something, right? Then we're getting like 5 value, which is pretty decent for a 0 cost 3 Gogan. I wanted to also kind of demonstrate that the value of a token can kind of change depending on the hero. So let's take a Ponder token, for instance. Both Kano and Prism make Ponder tokens. So Prism normally makes it off of Figment of Erudition, whereas Kano can make it off of like Aether Arc, I think. And these two heroes kind of use Ponder very, very differently. So Kano is a deck with a lot of blues, especially a lot of blues that you don't want to arsenal. So if we get a Ponder token, it's very likely that we're probably going to draw like a crappy blue off the top like Prognosticate, and we're not really super happy to arsenal. So we're not actually getting any value out of this Ponder token, right? But a Ponder token in Prism is substantially better. Prism does have like bricks that you can draw off a Ponder token, like a Figment or whatever. But for the most part, if you can draw like a Herald of Protection, the Ponder token is basically getting you +3 value, which is kind of insane. So I just wanted to kind of illustrate here that different heroes, like the value of certain effects can change depending on the hero. And a lot of the time, it's hard to just put a concrete value on like what a Ponder token is, because a Ponder token in Prism is substantially better than a Ponder token in Kano. And to kind of wrap it up here, I wanted to mention that a lot of mechanics are hard to evaluate precisely. And there are still a lot of mechanics that I think you can't put like a concrete number on. You can kind of do your best, but it kind of varies depending on the situation. So I think Spectre is a pretty good instance of this. Eye of Ophidia is like always like a pretty good effect, but in general, like maybe the op 2 doesn't matter. Like it can kind of vary, and maybe like it kind of depends on like where you're running Iphidia, mostly in Kano, but like other decks, the value of Iphidia is kind of questionable. We also have like marked. Marked as a mechanic is also very interesting because it's hard to evaluate a marked token because sometimes it ends up like not getting used, other times it's like very very good. So marked is also kind of an interesting mechanic to evaluate. And then transcend. Transcend is obviously numerically very good, but depends on the situation. Like, how do you precisely evaluate the value of a transcend card? And it's kind of difficult to do so, just because like the target that you can get, if you're like tutoring off Zen, or if you're like banishing to like Mask of Recurring Nightmares or whatever, the value can definitely change a lot. Fuse is also kind of a difficult one because you're basically having to almost like IP yourself sometimes to activate Fuse, which makes it kind of difficult because you're getting a very powerful effect, obviously, but if you fuse a card and you're like not able to use it and you like IP with it, it obviously feels pretty bad. And then Reprise and Clash are kind of also two a little bit difficult mechanics to evaluate, just because there is a little bit of like an RAG value element to them, which makes them sometimes very good. Like Test of Strength is one of Victor's like best cards for sure. But against like certain decks, Test of Strength is like actually not that good. Like let's say in the Victor mirror, for instance, right? And then Sinking Steelblade, Reprise is also a difficult mechanic to evaluate because if your opponent like doesn't block you, you basically like don't get any Reprise value. So these are all kind of examples of cards that I think are like cards and mechanics that I think are like difficult to evaluate, and you might have a hard time just assigning like a concrete number to these cards, like in the abstract. I think in the scenario of game, it's a lot easier to kind of assign value to these cards by like doing some math and figuring out how much that card is worth. So I think I'm gonna wrap up the conversation there. This has actually been a pretty difficult video to make, just because I kind of had to kind of organize my thoughts a lot over the course of a couple days, and also kind of record this in multiple takes. Hopefully it came out a little bit smoother. But yeah, if you like this series, let me know. If there's any kind of topics you want me to cover in the future, I'd be happy to kind of try to do a deep dive like I've kind of done here. And again, these are kind of like my own kind of opinions and views, so a lot of the vocabulary might not be shared within the broader community, and that's totally fine. These are kind of just how I define certain terms, so like ceiling, floor, value, rate, etc. So other people might have different definitions, and I don't think like my definitions are necessarily like the most correct or anything. That's just kind of how I view the game. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up there. So thank you all for watching. If you have any ideas in the comments for topics you want us to cover in the future, feel free to drop them there. And thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. And a special thank you to all the folks who decided it would be a good idea to give us $2 on Patreon. We really appreciate the support, but it's obviously never required.